There are major protests in Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, and local police are using water cannons and pepper spray to disperse demonstrators who are trying to approach or force entry into the presidential palace. More than 5 protesters and activists were detained from the scene. These protests occurred concurrently with local elections. The demonstrations were organized by opposition parties who accuse the ruling party of authoritarian and pro-Russian leanings. This is essentially Putin's worst fear as his long-term goals of annexing Georgia come to light. The ruling Georgia Dream Party claimed victory in all municipalities, but the 2 largest opposition blocs boycotted the vote, questioning its legitimacy. The opposition has been holding protests for over a year, starting after what they regarded as a fraudulent parliamentary election. The opposition accuses the government of shifting away from pro-Western, pro-EU orientation and moving towards Moscow. This is not good news for Vladimir Putin, who wants the local government to shift its views in favor of Putin's regime. The detained are charged with calling for the overthrow of authorities and may face up to 9 years in prison. These protests were widespread and included thousands of people who gathered in central squares. Many of them were seen waving Georgian and EU flags, while some protesters attempted to breach the presidential palace. But the local party responded to the protests by suggesting that Georgian Dream denies being pro-Russian because its ambition is EU membership while maintaining peace with Russia. But the political crisis continues, and these protests are likely to continue, as Putin faces the possibility of his propaganda campaign potentially being unsuccessful. There are important strategic and geopolitical dynamics that suggest that Vladimir Putin may have both motive and opportunity to exploit such unrest in Georgia. Let's talk a bit about the rationale and possible mechanisms by which the protests may both reflect and help further Russian ambitions, and why this is so dangerous for Georgia and the region more broadly. Georgia lies in the South Caucasus, bordering Russia to the north, and between Russia, Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Its geopolitical orientation has long been contested. Russia has historically treated the South Caucasus as a sphere of influence to prevent what it sees as encroachment by the West. Russia intervened in Georgia in the early 1900s. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia more directly, recognized those territories as independent, and stationed military presence there. It would not be unprecedented for Russia to consider annexing Georgia altogether. Russia has often preferred to keep conflicts unresolved in order to maintain leverage over post-Soviet states. Political instability in Georgia might help to keep the country weak and divided, and allow for additional pressure from Vladimir Putin. Georgia has long aspired to join the European Union and NATO. If internal unrest weakens pro-Western institutions or leads to a shift in government, Russia may see a strategic opening to reassert dominance. Given the situation currently playing out in Georgia, the protests and ensuing crisis could create vulnerabilities that a revisionist power like Putin might seek to exploit. Russia may support or discreetly fund pro-Russian factions within the Georgian ruling party or opposition blocs. If they are successful, Russia would be aiming to steer Georgia's internal politics towards Moscow's favor. Of course, Russia can also apply economic pressure to punish or extract concessions from a weak Georgian government. During times of crisis, Georgia may be more vulnerable to making compromises that benefit Putin's interests. The political instability seen in Georgia is not just a domestic issue, it is actually part of this broader geopolitical contest between Russia and the West. The Kremlin would have strong incentives to leverage the protests to weaken Georgia's orientation towards the EU and NATO, reassert influence, and possibly set conditions for more direct control. It would normally be fair to assume that domestic unrest in Georgia is ultimately favorable to Moscow's interests. But in reality, the protests carry serious risks for Russia and Vladimir Putin. There are many ways where the situation may backfire on Russia. A successful protest in Georgia, especially one that resists Russian influence, could inspire pro-democracy or pro-Western groups in the other Soviet or Russian-dominated states. That is the last thing that Putin would want to see in a place like Belarus or Kazakhstan. If Moscow is visibly seen as manipulating or intervening, it may use legitimacy among local populations, and protests may continue or even get worse. If Russia tries to intervene, it risks making the situation worse itself. Russia faces internal challenges in its economy, and it doesn't have the leverage that it would normally have during times of peace. There's also external military pressure against Russia, and more sanctions are already having a crippling effect on the Russian economy. Russians themselves, they might see a push on Georgia as reckless or unnecessary, especially if it leads towards a strategic miscalculation. A failure in Georgia would tarnish the image of strength that Putin seeks. The protests reflect deep legitimacy deficits. If the Georgian government responds with arrests or violence, it risks further eroding its moral authority and adding to the polarization within its borders. And in terms of joining the European Union, Georgia's EU candidacy was already stalled. The escalation of protests, charges against activists, and the government's hardline response make the idea of joining the European Union far less likely. This goes against the popular sentiment in Georgia that favors joining the European Union. For Putin, this reality is deeply troubling. His grand strategy depends on weakening neighboring states, breaking their ties to the West, and then creating a belt of buffer zones loyal to Moscow. Ukraine has already become a drain on his resources and a showcase of Russian military shortcomings. Up to this point, the protests do not indicate that Georgia is folding into Moscow's grip. They actually show that Georgians are pushing back hard against any move to silence their voice. This is kind of a paradox for Putin. Unrest in Georgia might on the surface look like an opportunity. A divided country is easier to manipulate, easier to pressure, and easier to destabilize. But in practice, popular uprisings against pro-Russian or authoritarian-leaning governments tend to ignite a change in local beliefs. Putin risks exposing his very obvious weakness. He cannot afford another Ukraine situation, nor can he afford to have the West see Georgia as the next front line of freedom where a Western democracy takes over. Georgia's protests are also a reminder that the Kremlin cannot suppress the will of the nations forever. There's a very clear reason that these protests are taking place. These protesters are in Tbilisi to make clear that they will not allow their future to be bartered away by the government, especially in favor of Moscow. In the months ahead, Georgia's crisis will remain a test. For the Georgian people, it is expected that these protests will continue until something major happens. Will the ruling party react with restraint? That question will be answered in the near future. And what about for Moscow? And what about for Vladimir Putin? If Moscow's attempts to influence the local government ultimately backfire, then these protests could mark not just a turning point for Russia, but another blow to Russia's imperial project. And that is Putin's worst fear about this entire situation in Georgia.